There's a lot happening right now that weighs heavy. The world feels unstable. The Constitution is being treated like optional reading, and Americans keep getting dragged into conflicts without Congress doing the one job the founders actually assigned to them. We're going to get into all of that, but before we do, I want to pause for one bright moment, because every once in a while, politics coughs up a little bit of accountability, kind of like an old furball. But last night, Dan Crenshaw, Eye Patch McCain, one of the worst neocon warmongers in Congress, got sent packing. This is the guy who built a brand as a tough-talking enforcer for the foreign policy establishment, the guy who was caught on a hot mic appearing to say that he was going to effing kill Tucker Carlson, and the guy who, according to podcaster Sean Ryan, threatened legal action after Ryan started asking uncomfortable questions about money and the lifestyle that Dan Crenshaw was living on a congressman's salary. Well, voters didn't care about the cable news polish or the warmongering. They cared about results, and they cared about trust. Crenshaw lost his Republican primary in the Texas 2nd Congressional District, and he didn't lose it by a nose or an eye. He lost it decisively by double digits. So yes, for just a moment, I'm going to enjoy that, because when neocons crash, it is in magnificent style. All right, now let's get into the real point of today's episode. Mark Levin, the self-proclaimed great one. And I promise no serious person has ever uttered those words with any truthfulness or sincerity. The guy who waves the Constitution around like a prop at a campaign rally. The guy with that high-pitched, frantic squirrel on a meth binge squeak. The little man who wraps himself in a flag. Not the flag flying over the White House, not the one in front of my house or yours, but the flag of another nation, the same flag pinned to the lapel of so many members of Congress and Senate right now. That guy, that Mark Levin, he posted something on X yesterday that is so historically illiterate, so constitutionally backwards that it demands a response. And it's not because I enjoy this, but because dozens, maybe multiple dozens of people actually listen to that guy and actually believe that he knows what he's talking about when it comes to the founding of our country. He doesn't. I'm going to prove it. Using the founders' own words, the actual convention records, the Federalist Papers, Supreme Court opinions, and the historical record that the shrill one, Mark Levin, either hasn't read or is deliberately misinterpreting. All right, this is going to be a not suitable for work warning. I'm going to show you the Mark Levin post. I'm going to leave it on the screen for about a minute, and I'm going to highlight 5 claims that he makes in the post, and I'm going to tear them apart one by one. So if there are any women or children in the room, or anybody with sensitivities or allergies to complete bullshit, please prepare yourself, because I'm going to show you this post. And I'm going to apologize in advance to all of you free-thinking liberty lovers out there subjecting your eyes to this nonsense. All right, check this out. All right, Mark Levin makes 5 claims, and here they are. Claim number 1, that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention did not confer war powers on Congress. Claim number 2, the delegates specifically changed the original draft from Congress having the power to make war to the power to declare war. Claim 3, Congress was granted the authority to declare its support for war, not declare war as a condition of making or going to war. Claim 4, declarations of war have never been determinative in whether war was made or not since the beginning of our republic. And claim number 5, Congress cannot force the commander-in-chief to go to war by the act of declaring war. So those are his 5 big claims in the post, and we're going to take our shot at tearing them apart one by one. All right, let's get after it one by one. The first claim was that delegates did not confer war powers on Congress. This is flat out false. Not a matter of interpretation, not a gray area. It's a lie. The delegates absolutely conferred war powers on Congress. And that was the entire point of Article 1, Section 8. The Constitution grants Congress, and Congress alone, the power to declare war, to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the regulation of the land and the naval forces, to call forth the militia, and to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia. That's not one war power. That is a suite of war powers, and every single one of them is vested in Congress. Now, even Alexander Hamilton, the founding father most sympathetic to executive power in the entire convention, He wrote in Federalist 69 that the president's authority as the commander-in-chief would amount to, and I'm quoting, nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military and the naval forces as first general and admiral of the Confederacy. And then Hamilton drew the critical contrast. He said that the power of the British king extends to declaring of war and to raising and regulating the fleets and the armies, all which, by the Constitution under consideration, would appertain to the legislature. Let that sink in for a minute. That's Hamilton. Not some anti-war activist, not some libertarian blogger, Alexander Hamilton, the most pro-executive founder in the room, telling the American people during ratification of the Constitution that the president cannot declare war. The president cannot raise armies. Those powers belong to Congress. And it wasn't just Hamilton. During the convention itself, Elbridge Gerry said that he never expected to hear in a republic a motion to empower the executive alone to declare war. He was shocked. Charles Pinckney argued that giving the executive war powers would, in his words, render the executive a monarch, and a monarch of the worst kind, an elected one. John Rutledge at the convention said that he was for vesting executive powers in a single person, but he did not favor giving that single person the power of war and peace. The delegates didn't just confer war powers on Congress, they fought to make sure that those powers stayed there. So that's claim number one. And we see now that Levin was wrong. All right, claim number two, that the delegates changed the draft from make war to declare war. This is the one true statement in Levin's entire post, and it's the one that he completely, catastrophically misunderstands. Yes, it's true. On August 17th of 1787, James Madison, Elbridge Gerry, they moved to change make war to declare war. The motion passed 8 states to 1. That is a historical fact. Levin was correct. But here's what Levin does. And this is where the intellectual fraud begins. He takes this one change and he inverts its meaning 180 degrees. The actual reason for the change is recorded in Madison's own notes from that day. Madison and Gerry proposed the substitution for the purpose of, and I'm quoting the convention notes directly, leaving to the executive the power to repel sudden attacks. That's it. That's the entire reason. The change was made so that the president could defend the country if Congress was out of session and a foreign army landed on American soil. A narrow military emergency exception, not a wholesale transfer of war-making authority to the president. And the delegates understood it exactly that way. Roger Sherman, a delegate at the convention, actually opposed the change, not because he wanted to give the president more power, but because he thought declare might narrow congressional authority too much. Sherman said make was better because declare risked, in his words, narrowing the power too much. Think about that. The objection was that the change might give Congress too little control, not too much. Then Rufus King, another delegate of the convention, clarified what ultimately sealed the deal. He noted that the word make war might be understood to mean conduct war, which was an executive function. So the change was also made clear that Congress decides whether to go to war. The president conducts the war once authorized. George Mason at the same convention summed it up. He was, quote, for clogging rather than facilitating war, but for facilitating peace. So the change from make to declare, it did two things, and only two things. One, it preserved the president's ability to repel sudden attacks without waiting for Congress. And two, it clarified that the president could conduct military operations after Congress authorized them. It did not, in any universe, mean that the president can take the nation to war without Congress. That is a fabrication. And Levin, the self-proclaimed constitutional scholar, either knows that and doesn't care, or he hasn't done his reading. Either way, quite embarrassing for the little fella. All right, claim number 3. Congress was granted authority to declare its support for war, not declare war as a condition of going to war. Now, this one is the most dangerous line in Levin's entire post, and it has zero basis in constitutional text, zero basis in the convention records, zero basis in the Federalist Papers, and zero basis in the way the founders actually governed. Declare its support for war. Where does that phrase even appear? It's not in the Constitution. It's not in Madison's notes. It's not in the Federalist Papers. It's not in the ratification debate. It's not in any letter or pamphlet or document from the founding era. Mark Levin completely invented it. He made it up. The power to declare war in the 18th century legal language, the language the framers were using, meant the power to change the legal state of the nation from peace to war. It wasn't a ceremonial rubber stamp. It was the sovereign act that authorizes hostilities. Now, if you want to know more about this, Michael Bolden at the 10th Amendment Center explains it really well. And I'll link the full episode to his podcast where he says, and I quote, "The power to declare war in and of itself isn't just about issuing a statement. It really is changing the state of things from peace to war. And of course, only Congress can make that call." Now, James Madison himself, the man who proposed the change from make to declare, wrote in Helvidius number 4, "The power to declare war, including the power of judging the causes of war, is fully and exclusively vested in the legislature. The executive has no right in any case to decide the question whether there is or is not cause for declaring war. In any case, no exceptions, no loopholes." This isn't some letter written in retirement. This is Madison actively fighting against the exact argument that Levin is making, while the ink on the Constitution was barely dry. He went further in Helvidius number 1, and he said, I quote, "A declaration that there shall be war is not an execution of laws. It does not suppose pre-existing laws to be executed. It is not in any respect an act merely executive. War making is a legislative function, period." He was clear about it. In Helvidius number 2, Madison warned that if any president were to presume the war-making power, no ramparts in the Constitution could defend the public liberty or scarcely the forms of Republican government. That's the father of the Constitution, folks. He's telling you that what Levin is advocating for would destroy a republic. Let me say that one more time. The man who wrote the clause in the Constitution says that Levin's interpretation would destroy the republic. And Levin calls himself an originalist? I don't think so. All right, claim number 4. Declarations of war have never been determinative since the beginning of our republic. This is Levin trying to use violations of the Constitution as evidence that the Constitution doesn't mean what it says. That's like arguing that because people speed on the highway, that speed limits don't exist. But let's look at the beginning of our republic, since Levin brought it up. The first major military confrontation under the Constitution was the Quasi-War with France in 1798. The French had seized over 300 American ships. So what happened? Did President John Adams just unilaterally launch a war? No. In fact, he did exactly what we're supposed to do. He went to Congress, and Congress passed specific statutes authorizing limited naval hostilities. The Secretary of War, James McHenry, after consulting with Alexander Hamilton, advised Adams in writing that the president, as commander-in-chief, cannot employ the Navy in acts of war previous to war being declared by Congress, nor in acts of reprisals short of war for the same reason. Congress alone having the power to authorize the one or the other. Now, I want to stop here for just a second because the language matters. And I want to make sure everybody kind of understands what Hamilton and McHenry were actually saying. They drew a very clear line using two concepts that the founding generation understood precisely and that Mark Levin apparently does not. The first concept is repel force by force. This is a very narrow emergency power, and it means exactly what it sounds like. If somebody is shooting at you now, if a foreign navy is attacking an American ship at this moment, the president can order the military to shoot back. You match the force being used against you in real time while the attack is happening. That's it. That's the whole power. You don't get to chase them home. You don't get to hit their ports next week. You don't get to launch a bombing campaign next month. You repel the attack that is underway, and the moment it stops, your unilateral executive authority ends. McHenry put it to Adams plainly. The president's power does not include the power to capture or even the exertion of force a moment longer than it is employed against them. Not a moment longer. Seems pretty clear. That's the constitutional leash on executive war power. The second concept I want to talk about is reprisals. A reprisal is the next step up. It's an offensive action taken in response to a wrong that's already been committed. Think of it as retaliation. The French seized your ships last month, so you go hit a French port or capture a French vessel. That is not defensive. That is not repelling a sudden attack. That is a deliberate, planned act of force. And under the founding framework, that requires congressional authorization. Always. Hamilton was explicit. Anything beyond repelling force by force must fall under the idea of reprisals and requires the sanctions of that department, which is to declare or make war. And notice, Hamilton used declare and make interchangeably right there, because to the founding generation, they meant the same thing when it came to congressional authority. So the line is clean. If somebody is punching you in the face right now, you can punch back. But if someone punched you last week and you want to kick down their door, that's a reprisal, and you would need to go to Congress to authorize it. The founders understood human nature well enough to know that without that line, every president would frame every act of aggression as a defensive emergency. And that is exactly what has happened every single time the constitutional order has been ignored. Now, let's talk about the next war up, the War of 1812. Madison, the actual author of the Declare War Clause, was now the president of the United States, and Britain was impressing American soldiers, running blockades, and committing acts of war. Did Madison strike back unilaterally? Nope, he didn't. He went to Congress, and on June 1st, 1812, he laid out the British aggressions, and he said, in his own language, whether the United States shall continue passive under these progressive usurpations or opposing force to force in defense of their national rights is a solemn question which the Constitution wisely confides to the legislative department of the government. The Constitution wisely confides that decision to Congress, not to the president. That's James Madison, the author of the Constitution, the guy who wrote the clause. He's telling you exactly what it means, and it doesn't stop there. When the Diet of Algiers declared war on the United States in July of 1812, Madison waited over 2 years through active hostilities, through American ships being captured. He waited until the war with Britain was resolved. Then he went back to Congress and asked for authorization against Algiers. And he didn't get a full declaration. Congress authorized a limited naval war, and Madison operated strictly within those limits. The man who proposed changing make to declare, when he was the president facing 2 simultaneous hot wars, followed the Constitution to the letter. Twice. The Supreme Court backed this up. In Bass versus Tingey in 1800, the court recognized that Congress can authorize both full declarations of war and limited imperfect wars through statute, but authorization must come from Congress. In Talbot v. Seaman in 1801, Chief Justice John Marshall wrote, the whole powers of war being, by the Constitution of the United States, vested in Congress. The acts of that body can alone be resorted to as our guides. And Little v. Barim, 1804, the court held that when the president's military orders exceeded what Congress had specifically authorized, those orders were unlawful, even during an active conflict. So when Levin says declarations of war have never been determinative, the actual history of the early republic says the exact opposite. Congressional authorization was the prerequisite every single time. All right, claim 5. Congress cannot force the commander-in-chief to go to war. This is what Levin does best. This is the straw man argument. And Levin knows it because there is nobody is arguing that Congress can force the president to wage war. That's not the issue. That has never been the issue. The issue is whether the president can take the nation into war without Congress. And the answer from the convention, from the Federalist Papers, from the founders' letters, from their conduct in office, and from the Supreme Court is no. Madison addressed this directly. The president's role, as Madison described it, is to convene and give information to the legislature on occasions that may demand it. He needs to go to Congress and make his case. The president presents the case. Congress decides. If Congress authorizes force, the president then conducts the operations. If Congress says no, the president's only unilateral authority is to repel active attacks, force by force, and not one moment longer. That's the constitutional design. Mark Levin is attacking a position that nobody actually holds to avoid defending the position that he actually occupies. which is that the president can bomb, invade, blockade, and wage sustained military operations anywhere on earth without a vote from the people's representatives. That's not constitutional conservatism, Mark. That's monarchism with an American accent. So here's what really bothers me about this. Mark Levin, he calls himself a constitutionalist. He has a show called Life, Liberty, and Levin. He wrote a book called Liberty and Tyranny. He positions himself as the great defender of the founding. But on the single most consequential power in the Constitution, the power to send Americans to fight and die, he sides with imperial presidency over the founders every single time. He made this exact argument during Libya, and Tom Woods challenged him publicly. He asked him to produce one Federalist supporter from the entire ratification period who argued that the president could launch non-defensive wars without Congress. Levin could never produce one because there isn't one. James Madison called war powers the wisest part of the Constitution. He said the Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. He said war is the true nurse of executive aggrandizement. He warned the strongest passions and the most dangerous weakness of man, ambition, avarice, vanity, the love of fame, were all in conspiracy against the desire and duty of peace. That's why the founders put this power in Congress, not as a formality, not as a suggestion, as a structural safeguard for liberty itself. And anybody who tells you otherwise, whether they have a law degree, a radio show, a podcast, or a few dozen followers, Mark Levin, is either ignorant of the founding or, which is more likely, they're lying about it. So if you want to understand what the founders actually said about war powers, go and read Federalist 69. Go and read Madison's Helvidius essays. Go listen to Michael Bolden's episode on Madison and the War of 1812 at the 10th Amendment Center. I'll link all of it below. The primary sources are clear. They're consistent, and they're devastating to Mark Levin's argument. The question isn't whether Mark Levin is wrong, because he is. The question is whether enough Americans still care about the Constitution and what it actually says to hold their government accountable. I think they do. And that's why we fight, and I hope that you will join us. Visit bringourtroopshome.us and defendtheguard.us. Chip in a few bucks and help us continue this fight.